Good morning, everybody. Today's lesson, we're going to have two basic goals. We are going to think about how to structure our essay for the argument for Major Paper 1, and we're also going to think about counter argument, which is part of that structure. And then lastly, hopefully we have time to do all these things, we're going to take some notes on logical fallacies. So it might feel a little shoehorned in here at the end, but the main reason that I'm doing that is because I would like for us to talk about fallacies a little bit, since election day is coming up and it's a good opportunity to be thinking about political advertisements and political messaging that we see. So we're going to start today by going to pages 111 through 115 in the language of composition. I want you to read through the description of the classical oration model and then also to read the sample essay that is given to you in your book, that is actually also labeled explaining to you the classical oration model. So you should have read those pages, and what I would like to draw your attention to in the classical oration model, I think that I like that this is a flexible model, that it does not label the parts as paragraphs. You could have multiple paragraphs for any one of these particular parts. I also like that it gives you a structure for thinking about the counter argument, and it also gives you information about the various appeals and where you should be using those. For instance, in the introduction part, it talks about how you should be establishing ethos, and how sometimes in the narration you might be thinking about things like logos and pathos. I think that's really useful for you to think about. I would say, as far as structuring your papers for next week, the only part that I think is kind of up for debate here is where you want to put the response to the opposition. In the classical oration model, that is placed right before the conclusion, so it gives you a chance to kind of wrap up any potential debates. But there are other argumentation styles that use the or place the response to the opposition differently. For instance, in Rogerian argument, it actually begins with a response to the opposition, and I think sometimes that can be good, especially if you have an opposition that feels as if it is very much, kind of the elephant in the room that you need to go ahead and discuss, and get out of the way early. Another option for you is to just address the opposition sort of as it comes up naturally in your argument. So it doesn't have to have its own paragraph. It could actually be within a body paragraph. So say you're making a point and you kind of know what the opposition to that point would be. You could go ahead and refute that within that actual body paragraph. Remember that you have the graphic organizer that I shared with you. You just had to make a copy of it. I'm not taking up your notes or taking up that graphic organizer, but I do think it's helpful for you to think about the structure of your paper. So we're going to focus mainly on thesis today and response to opposition. So starting with thesis, if you haven't written your thesis for your paper yet, please start a draft of it either in the paper document or in the graphic organizer. I think any of the three methods, counter argument, closed, or open, will work. You just need to make sure that you're taking a very clear position and that you're avoiding using first or second person. It's not that you can't use first or second person, first person. I think in particular, I think second person is better to avoid, but it's not that you can't use first person. If you were relating a personal experience, you could. But if you took two thesis statements and one of them started with I and one of them didn't. So if I said, I think that capital punishment should be banned in the United States, and then if I said capital punishment should be banned in the United States and took out the I think, that sounds stronger. It's still your opinion. We all know it's your opinion. You're the one writing the essay. But the elimination of the I think or I believe has a tendency to kind of weaken claims. And so it's a good thing to kind of go through and think about where you could eliminate that in your claims. So I just want you to take a minute and work on drafting those thesis statements. For those of you who are at home and who are virtual, keep in mind that during my advisory time or during my office hour on Friday, you're more than welcome to send me little pieces of your paper. If you've got a thesis you want me to read through with you, if you have maybe an introduction done, etc. I think as far as the schedule of when you should have things kind of wrapped up, is I think it's a good idea to have a draft, mostly done of your paper for next Monday, Tuesday. We will talk about editing. I'll be able to take some questions from your paper on that day, because then following that will just be the paper being due do. And so there won't be much time for you to get a lot of your questions answered or to work on your paper. On those days, we'll talk a little bit more about what I'll be looking for in the grading, and then also thinking a little bit more about maybe a model. We might look at a model from one of my papers from last year. Okay, so responding to the opposition. So consider your thesis first and think about what is the position that I'm taking and what might be some objections to that thesis. If you can't think of any objection, then I think a couple of potential issues should come to mind. If you can't think of an objection, then do you have an arguable thesis? Because there should always be a reasonable person who could disagree with your thesis. Otherwise, maybe you're just making an argument that isn't really valid or important. Like if I said that like smoking can cause cancer, I don't know. We've kind of decided that that's true, right? I mean, I don't think that there are very many reasonable people who are going to come out and say that smoking is good for you. And so I think that, just keeping in mind, if you can't think of something, then, that might be potentially a problem. The other issue might be that you just haven't read enough about your topic, because if you've done enough reading, you should have come across objections. You should have come across people who see things differently than you. And it's also a good idea to have sources like that in your paper, something that's an opposition source that then you can kind of make a case for the opposing side. So take one of those oppositions and write for 5 minutes as if you are from that opposing side. All right, so I'm going to give you a couple of examples of times in pieces of writing that we have already read this year of where the writer is, conceding and refuting. So this is a fairly common way to respond to the opposition. It's where you basically give over a point, but then you explain why your point is either more important or more valid or more true than the other point. This first example is from Bryan Stevenson's TED Talk. And I want to draw your attention to this passage and a couple of sentences within it. So he says, I represent people on death row. It's interesting, this question of the death penalty. In many ways, we've been taught to think that the real question is, do people deserve to die for the crimes they've committed? And that's a very sensible question. But there's another way of thinking about where we are in our identity. The other way of thinking about it is not, do people deserve to die for the crimes they commit, but do we deserve to kill? I mean, it's fascinating. So in this passage, you see a very, very common methodology for responding to the opposition, and it's what I'll basically call the okay, but strategy. So in the sentence where he says, and that's a very sensible question, do you see how he's kind of saying, okay, I'll give you that as a sensible question, but there's another way of thinking. That's the refutation part, right? Where he's saying, okay, I'll give you that that's an interesting question or even a sensible way to look at it. But what if we looked at it in this completely different way? This is Stevenson changing the conversation, changing the way people think about the death penalty, and also making his own claim, right? That the thing that's really important is not whether or not people deserve it, but whether we deserve to kill them. Okay, we're going to look at one more example. This is from Barack Obama's speech and eulogy for Clementa Pinckney. And so he says, for too long, we were blind to the pain that the Confederate flag stirred in too many of our citizens. It's true, a flag did not cause these murders. But as people from all walks of life, Republicans and Democrats now acknowledge, including Governor Haley, whose recent eloquence on the subject is worthy of praise, as we all have to acknowledge, the flag has always represented more than just ancestral pride. For many, black and white, that flag was a reminder of systemic oppression and racial subjugation. We see that now. So you should see here that he's following the exact same pattern. It's true, a flag did not cause these murders. That's the okay part. And then the next sentence, but as many people from all walks of life have realized, the flag always represented more than just ancestral pride. So again, okay, I'll give you this, but I'm going to kind of bring up something else that I think is more important and that I think is, more related to the point that I'm trying to make. So again, standard response to the opposition. Okay, but. So you have to first of all understand what the opposing side believes so that you can do that. And I'm going to show you a resource that I have linked here in just a second, but I also want to draw your attention to this last point. You have to know the opposition before you can truly respond to it. So you have to be able to accurately represent them. If you try to, if you've ever heard people arguing, they're like, only a crazy person would think that that's true. That's something that we would call, well, I don't know if this is exactly the straw man fallacy, but it's kind of related to the straw man fallacy. When politicians or writers or thinkers or just people who are having an argument use the straw man fallacy, it's when they misrepresent the opposing side to make the opposing side seem as if it is more simple or more, to basically just misrepresent the opposing side to make it easier to argue with, just like it would be easier to knock down a straw man than it would be to knock down a flesh and blood man. And so we don't want to be guilty of that particular fallacy or any fallacy. So the document that I have linked here is a set of templates from a book called They Say, I Say. And They Say, I Say is basically the okay, but, that here's what they say, here's what I say. And this basically just gives you a set of templates that you could use to respond to the opposition. And there's just places for you to plug in your ideas. So we'll look here. So by focusing on blank, X overlooks the deeper problem of blank. So you could really do the Brian Stevenson here. You could say, by focusing on whether or not we should have the right to, or whether or not people deserve to die for their crimes, we are overlooking whether or not we have the right to kill people for their crimes, right? You see how you could kind of plug that right into that template. So you should be able to use these. And again, you don't have to use these, but if you find yourself having a little bit of trouble responding to opposition, these are a good starting point. And I think once you get used to some of the patterns that you see here, it will become easier for you to do this a little bit more naturally in your own writing. Okay, so the last thing that we're going to do today is you're going to go to today's class materials, copy and paste the slide for logical fallacies into your skills notebook. So there is a slide that I've posted. I will pull it up right now so you can see it. Logical fallacies. Okay, so it looks like this, and it has a place for you to take notes on the various fallacies that are in your book. So fallacies of relevance, meaning that, maybe you're making a comparison or talking about something that doesn't really relate to the overall argument. Fallacies of accuracy. You can see that the straw man fallacy is included there. Fallacies of insufficiency, so hasty generalization, circular reasoning. And then it has a place for you to look for 3 additional fallacies and to attach them up above. And then there's a part for application. And this is what I wanted us to be able to get to right now, because I think that this is a fun activity for us to do in a political season. So it says, during this political season, which type of fallacy seems to be most pervasively used as a substitute for logical reasoning? And I want you to keep in mind that we talk about fallacies and we talk about them as being negative, and they are negative because they're not logical. But just because something's not logical doesn't mean it's not effective. And so political parties and candidates don't use things to be ineffective, right? They use things to be effective and things that they think will work on an audience. And so when they're using these fallacies, they are doing it intentionally, and they're doing it because they work a lot of times. So at the bottom, it has a place for you to give. It says, provide specific examples demonstrating how each of the 2 main political parties or candidates has used this particular logical fallacy this election year, or the fallacy each has used most this election year. So you might actually have to look up some ads. You could look for like presidential ads. I'm sure you could find, your top hits of Biden ads, top hits of Trump ads, and watch those and then try to figure out which fallacy do I think is appearing most often. I think it's fun to try to identify these, out in the world, because then you start to notice them kind of everywhere that you're reading and watching television. So that's kind of the final thing I want you to do today. And then for next class, we'll do a little bit more work with logical fallacies, and hopefully you'll be able to share some of the ideas that you came up with for numbers 6 and 7. Oh, and one more thing. So for next class, you need to have most of a rough draft. I might have mentioned this at the beginning of the video, but now I can't remember. You need to have most of a rough draft done because we'll be able to talk about editing and all of that on Monday, Tuesday.